Keanu Reeves was used to the quiet streets of Los Angeles after a long day of shooting. The city, usually buzzing with energy, was still and calm as he made his way home. It was the kind of evening where the air had a chill to it, and the only sounds were the faint hum of distant traffic and the soft shuffle of his shoes on the sidewalk. Keanu loved these walks. There was something peaceful about them, an escape from the glitz and glamour of Hollywood. But tonight, as he turned down an alley just a few blocks from his apartment, something was different. A soft, muffled sound reached his ears. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but then it came again. A whimpering. It was faint, almost too soft to hear, but there was something unmistakable about it. He paused and glanced around. The alley was dimly lit, the streetlights flickering occasionally. No one was in sight. His curiosity piqued. Keanu walked slowly toward the sound. It wasn't unusual for him to see homeless people or stray animals in the alleys, but this was different. The whimpering grew a little louder. As he approached the trash can near the far corner of the alley, he stopped in his tracks. There, half hidden beneath some discarded wrappers and old newspapers, was a small bundle. It was barely visible, but the faint sound of a baby's cry was unmistakable. Keanu's heart skipped a beat. A baby? In the trash? Without thinking, he rushed over and knelt down. His hands shook slightly as he pushed aside the garbage, revealing a tiny, fragile form wrapped in a tattered blanket. The baby's face, barely visible, was scrunched up in distress, its tiny chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Keanu's breath caught in his throat. His first instinct was to check for any signs of life. He gently lifted the baby, holding it close to his chest, feeling its warmth against his body. The baby was alive. Barely, but alive. "What the hell?" Keanu muttered, his mind racing. His thoughts were a blur, a mixture of disbelief and anger. Who could do something like this? Leave a defenseless child to die in the trash? He didn't have time to think. His hand instinctively reached for his phone, dialing 911. "This is Keanu Reeves," he said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. "There's a baby, a newborn, in a trash can, on the corner of 3rd Street and Oak Avenue. I need help now." He hung up, the urgency of the situation sinking in. His heart pounded as he held the baby tighter, trying to keep it warm. Every second felt like an eternity. He needed help. The baby needed help. And in that moment, everything changed. Keanu wasn't just an actor anymore. He wasn't the guy people saw on the big screen or the person they recognized on the street. Right then, he was just a man holding a baby, fighting against time. As he waited for the paramedics, the baby's cries slowed, and Keanu's chest tightened. Could he have done something wrong? Was it too late? But there was no time to second guess. The only thing that mattered was that he had to make sure this baby was going to be okay. The ambulance arrived moments later, its sirens blaring down the street, cutting through the stillness of the night. Keanu didn't wait for them to park properly. He rushed toward the vehicle, still holding the tiny baby in his arms. His heart was racing. He had never felt so helpless, so desperate for someone else to take over. The paramedics leaped out, one of them immediately rushing to Keanu's side. A woman, probably in her mid-30s, with short dark hair and a look of calm authority, gently took the baby from his arms. Keanu was hesitant to let go, but he knew the professionals could do what he couldn't. "We've got this," the paramedic said reassuringly. "You did the right thing by bringing her in." Keanu nodded, feeling a surge of relief, but it was quickly replaced by a gnawing sense of doubt. Was it enough? Was the baby too far gone? He had no idea how long she had been abandoned in that trash can, but from the way she had looked, so fragile, so small, Keanu couldn't shake the thought that he might be too late. As the paramedics rushed the baby into the back of the ambulance, Keanu followed them, keeping a few steps behind. His mind was reeling. He couldn't stop thinking about how vulnerable the baby was, how someone could just leave her, as though her life meant nothing. The thought made his stomach churn. The lead paramedic, a man in his 40s with a calm demeanor, glanced over, his shoulder at Keanu as they worked. "Hey, you did great," he said, his voice steady. It looks bad, but we've got the baby stabilized for now. She's alive. That's what matters. Keanu nodded, but the worry didn't leave his face. He was far from reassured. As the ambulance sped down the street, Keanu's thoughts turned inward. This wasn't something he could just walk away from. He had a choice. He could go home, forget about the night's events, and let the professionals handle it, or he could stay and make sure the baby was going to be okay. Something told him he couldn't leave it up to chance. He made his decision. "I'm coming with you," Keanu said, his voice firm. The paramedics exchanged a brief look, but there was no hesitation in his tone. "We'll need you to stay out of the way at the hospital," the woman paramedic said, "but we'll make sure you can be there when we get her checked in." Keanu agreed, but it wasn't the official hospital protocols that were on his mind now. The thought of a life hanging by a thread, of a baby left in the cold, abandoned by those who should have cared for her, struck him in ways he couldn't explain. They arrived at the hospital and Keanu stayed close, standing in the background as the baby was rushed inside. His hands were still shaking, though he couldn't tell if it was from the cold night air or the weight of everything that had just happened. The waiting room was a blur. Keanu barely registered the passing minutes. He sat, then stood, pacing, restlessly, his mind spinning with questions. How could someone do this? How could anyone just leave a baby to die in the trash? He couldn't stop thinking about the baby's tiny, fragile form, how her skin felt like paper, her little face, pale from the cold. She was a stranger to him, yet she felt like she had become a part of him in that instant. Just as the thought of leaving crossed his mind, a nurse came through the door, her face relieved. "She's stable now," the nurse said with a small smile. "It's a miracle you found her when you did. She's going to be okay, but she's going to need a lot of care. We're putting her in the NICU for now." Keanu let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His body sagged in relief. The storm of emotions that had been crashing through him began to subside, but there was still a lingering feeling, a gut-wrenching sadness that stayed with him. This baby had a future, he was sure of it now. But how many others wouldn't? "Can I see her?" Keanu asked, his voice softer now. The nurse nodded. "For a few minutes, but she's very fragile. We don't want to overwhelm her." Keanu followed her down the sterile white hallways, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the quiet. As they turned a corner, Keanu caught sight of the tiny incubator where the baby lay, her tiny body wrapped in a blanket. Her chest rose and fell with every breath, slow but steady. She looked so peaceful now, the chaos of earlier fading from her features. Keanu stood at the foot of her bed, watching her with a mix of awe and disbelief. She was alive. Against all odds, she was alive. For the first time that night, Keanu felt a glimmer of hope. The baby had made it through the worst of it. But as he stood there gazing down at her, he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. There was more to come, and for him the journey wasn't just about saving a life. It was about understanding what it meant to be truly human in the face of overwhelming darkness. To step forward, even when the path ahead was uncertain. As Keanu looked down at the baby, a quiet thought crossed his mind. This might just be the beginning. The hours seemed to drag on as Keanu sat in the waiting room, his thoughts swirling like a storm in his mind. The world outside was a blur. The headlights of passing cars and the quiet hum of the city beyond all seemed so distant. The adrenaline from the discovery of the baby had faded, leaving behind a profound exhaustion. But it wasn't just physical tiredness. Keanu felt an emotional weight pressing on him, one that hadn't quite left since he found that little soul in the trash. His phone buzzed, snapping him back to reality. It was a text from his friend Alex, a fellow actor and someone Keanu had known for years. "Hey man, how was the shoot? You good?" Keanu stared at the message, his thumb hovering over the screen. How could he explain what had happened tonight? How could he tell Alex that he'd found a baby, abandoned and left for dead, and now was sitting in a hospital waiting room, wondering if she would survive? Instead of replying, Keanu put his phone down. The message didn't matter, not right now. He got up and walked over to the nurse's station. "How is she?" he asked, his voice steady but full of concern. The nurse, a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes gave him a gentle smile. "She's doing much better. We've got her hooked up to an IV and some oxygen, but the doctors are hopeful. We're monitoring her closely, but there's a good chance she's going to make it through." Keanu felt a wave of relief wash over him. It was like the tightness in his chest had loosened, but there was still a lingering knot. He knew the baby's life was still fragile, and there were so many unknowns ahead. But for now, there was hope. "Thank ye." "You," he said softly, his voice sincere. I'm just glad she's alive." The nurse nodded. "It's a miracle, really. People like you, stepping in when no one else would, are the reason she's still here." Keanu shook his head, slightly embarrassed by the praise. He wasn't a hero. He hadn't done anything extraordinary. He had just acted on instinct. But the nurse's words made him pause. Maybe there was something in him, something more than just an actor on a screen, that had been awakened tonight. He hadn't thought about it until now, but perhaps he had just started down a path he wasn't expecting. "What happens now?" Keanu asked, trying to steer the conversation. "What will happen to her?" The nurse sighed, a slight frown crossing her face. "The next steps are up in the air. We've got her stable, but we don't know who left her there. We'll have to do a full investigation to figure out how she ended up in that trash. After that, it'll be a matter of finding a family for her." Keanu felt a pang in his chest. A family. The thought of the baby being left in the cold, unwanted, made his heart ache. "Is there anyone who will want her?" The nurse hesitated before answering, looking down at the chart in her hand. "It's hard to say. Babies like her don't always get adopted right away, but there are always people looking to give a child a home. It's just a matter of time." Keanu nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something needed to be done. He'd been thrown into this situation, but now that he was here, he couldn't just walk away. Not when that little life hung in the balance. Just then, Keanu heard the soft sound of footsteps approaching. A woman in her late 30s with tired eyes and an air of exhaustion around her walked in. She was wearing a police badge and a dark jacket, and she had a no-nonsense demeanor about her. "Mr. Reeves?" she asked, her voice clipped but polite. Keanu turned to face her. "Yes?" "I'm Detective Collins," she introduced herself, extending her hand. "I'm in charge of the case. I need to ask you a few questions." Keanu's heart skipped. The weight of the situation just became more real. This wasn't just about a baby anymore. It was about a crime. Someone had done this. "Of course," Keanu replied, his voice firm despite the unease creeping into his chest. They walked over to a quieter corner of the waiting room, where Keanu took a seat. Detective Collins sat across from him, flipping open a small notebook. "I'll keep this brief, but I need to know exactly what happened," she said, her pen poised above the page. "What were you doing when you found the baby? Did you see anything suspicious?" Keanu's mind replayed the moment over and over. He could still hear the baby's faint cry in the alley. He could still feel the chill of the night as he held her in his arms. "I was walking home," Keanu began, his voice steady but still holding that edge of disbelief. "It was late and I heard something. It was soft at first, almost like a cat meowing, but then I realized it was a baby crying. I went to check and I found her in a trash can. She was wrapped in a blanket, but it was torn and she was barely moving." Detective Collins took notes as Keanu spoke, nodding thoughtfully. "Did you see anyone around the area? Anything unusual? Did anyone leave her there?" Keanu shook his head. "No, I didn't see anyone. It was just empty. I didn't think twice. I called 911 right away." The detective paused, clearly processing the information. "Okay, well, we're going to try and track down any potential witnesses, but you're the first piece of the puzzle. You've done more than enough." Keanu nodded, though the unease in his gut hadn't gone away. The baby was in the hospital now, safe, for the moment, but the people responsible for this, they were still out there. "Is there any chance I can stay in touch about her?" Keanu asked, his voice quieter now, almost as if he was unsure of what he was asking. I feel like I need to make sure she's okay. I want to help if I can." Detective Collins looked at him for a moment, then gave him a small nod. "We'll keep you updated, and thank you for stepping in when no one else did, but be prepared. This case may take some time." Keanu swallowed, the weight of her words settling on him like a heavy coat. But no matter how long it took, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't done here. He couldn't just walk away. He needed to know that the baby was going to have a future, a good one, and if there was anything he could do to make that happen, he would. The days that followed blurred together, each one more filled with uncertainty than the last. Keanu found himself thinking about the baby constantly. She was always on his mind, her tiny, fragile body. The way she cried when he first found her, and how after all the turmoil, she had settled into peaceful slumber in the hospital. He kept hoping that when he visited, she would be stronger, more alive, as though each day that passed would bring her closer to being the vibrant, full-of-life child she was meant to be. But the truth was, Keanu didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know how long the investigation would last or what would become of the baby once she was well enough to leave the hospital. He didn't know if anyone would step forward to adopt her, or if she would end up in the foster system, waiting for someone to give her the love and care she deserved. On the 5th day after the discovery, Keanu received a call from Detective Collins. His heart skipped when he saw her name on his phone. He had been expecting an update for a while but hadn't wanted to ask. Now here it was. Keanu, the detective's voice was calm but direct. We've been looking into the case and we've run into a bit of a wall. Keanu's stomach clenched. What do you mean, you haven't found anything? No, she replied. It's not that. It's just that we don't have any leads, no surveillance footage, no witnesses. The baby was abandoned in an area that's typically quiet, and no one saw anything. We don't even have fingerprints or anything concrete from the scene. Keanu swallowed. He could feel his frustration rising. So, you're telling me the person who did this is still out there and no one knows anything? Exactly, Detective Collins said, but I'm not giving up. We'll keep working on it. Keanu let out a breath, trying to push down the anger. He had to remain calm. What happens to the baby now? Well, she's doing better. She's out of the NICU and in a regular ward now, which is a good sign, but her future is still up in the air. If we can't find the parents or someone who is related to her, she'll go into foster care. And frankly, the wait for a permanent home can be long. The words felt like a punch to his gut. A baby in foster care? Left to grow up without the love of a family? Keanu paused before speaking again, his voice quieter now. Can I meet with her? I just want to see her. I need to make sure she's okay. Detective Collins hesitated for a moment before answering. I'll arrange something, but I have to remind you, Keanu, this is all still part of an ongoing investigation. You're not obligated to do anything. I don't want you to feel like you need to take on more than you can handle. Keanu's heart raced as he replied, I understand, but I can't walk away from this. I can't. She's too important. Detective Collins seemed to sense the urgency in his voice. I'll have the hospital arrange a time for you to visit, but remember, this isn't over yet. As the call ended, Keanu felt a strange mix of anticipation and anxiety. He wasn't sure what he was hoping for, but he knew that he couldn't let go of the baby. Not now, not after everything that had happened. She had become a part of him, even though he hadn't expected it. He couldn't shake the thought of her being all alone, with no one to protect her. Later that afternoon, Keanu made his way back to the hospital. It was a quiet drive, the city streets stretching out in front of him, as his thoughts remained locked on the baby. He could still feel the weight of her in his arms, could still hear her fragile cries echoing in his mind. What would her future look like? Would she have the chance to grow up with a family who cared for her? Or would she be another forgotten child? As Keanu walked into the hospital, the familiar sterile scent filled his nostrils. It was an environment he'd come to know all too well over the last few days. He moved through the halls with purpose, making his way to the NICU, where the nurse at the desk greeted him with a soft smile. You must be Mr. Reeves, the nurse said. The baby is in room 302 now. She's doing well today, but we're still keeping an eye on her. Keanu nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. As he made his way to the room, the reality of what he was about to do started to set in. He had already seen the baby once, but this time things felt different. This time he wasn't just a witness to a tragedy. He was part of her story. When he stepped into the room, the baby was lying in a small crib, a light blanket tucked around her. Her eyes were closed, her tiny fingers curled into little fists. Keanu stood there for a moment, just watching her, letting the weight of the moment sink in. There was a peacefulness to her now, a stillness that contrasted sharply with the chaos of the night he found her. He took a tentative step closer, his heart aching. He didn't know what he was supposed to do. Was he supposed to speak to her, hold her? He wasn't sure if he was ready for that kind of responsibility. But something deep inside him told him he had to do something. Keanu pulled a chair over to the crib and sat down. For a while he just watched her, letting the silence settle around them. Then softly he whispered, "I don't know who did this to you, little one, but I won't let you be alone. I'll make sure you're okay." A tear slid down his cheek, but he didn't brush it away. He let it fall because in that moment he realized something. The baby wasn't just a victim of circumstance. She was a symbol of something much bigger, a reminder that even in the most broken moments, there was always a chance to rebuild. Keanu's journey wasn't just about finding the person responsible for abandoning her. It was about finding the strength within himself to take the next step forward, no matter how uncertain or difficult it seemed. And as he sat there with the baby in front of him, Keanu knew one thing for sure. He wasn't just going to walk away. Not now. Not ever. Days after Keanu's visit to the hospital felt like a whirlwind. His life, which had always been a blend of filming, interviews, and quiet moments of reflection, had been completely upended. Now the baby, a fragile, vulnerable child who had been abandoned in the trash, was his focus. His thoughts drifted to her at all hours of the day, and no matter where he was, the image of her tiny form in that hospital crib never left him. He found himself making frequent trips to the hospital, staying for hours, speaking with the doctors and nurses, trying to learn everything he could about the baby's progress. Each time he visited, the baby seemed to get a little stronger, a little brighter. She had survived against all odds, but Keanu couldn't shake the feeling that her life was still so fragile, so uncertain. It wasn't long before Keanu started, spending more time in the nursery with her, holding her in his arms for longer stretches. He found a deep comfort in these moments, even though he knew he wasn't her father, and he wasn't equipped to give her the kind of stability she needed. But there was something about her, something about the way she gazed up at him with wide eyes that made him feel like he had a purpose beyond the life he had known. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling day on set, Keanu made his way to the hospital as he had done every day for the past week. He needed to see her, to know she was okay. When he arrived, Detective Collins was already there, sitting in the waiting area, a file folder in her lap. Her eyes met his as he entered, and she gave him a tight smile. "Keanu," she said, her voice low but not unfriendly. "I'm glad you're here." Keanu returned the smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "How's she doing?" "She's doing well," Detective Collins replied. "The doctors are optimistic. She's getting stronger each day, and her condition is improving. But—" She hesitated for a moment, as though weighing her words. "I think it's time to talk about the next steps." Keanu frowned. "Next steps? What do you mean?" "I mean, the longer she's in the hospital, the more we need to figure out what happens after that. Foster care, adoption, it's all part of the process, but I wanted to talk to you about something." Keanu's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" The detective shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable with what she was about to say. "Keanu, I know this might be difficult to hear, but there's something about your visits that's been standing out. I've been talking to the hospital staff, and they've mentioned that you've been spending a lot of time with her. You're attached to her, and I think you're starting to get attached in a way that could lead to something more." Keanu's chest tightened. He hadn't been ready to admit it to himself, but hearing it from her made it more real. "What are you saying exactly?" "I'm saying," she continued, "that you might be getting emotionally involved, and I just want to be sure you understand what that means. Taking responsibility for a child, especially one with her kind of history, is no small thing. It's a lifetime commitment. It's a decision that can't be taken lightly." Keanu nodded, his mind racing. Of course he had thought about this. How could he not? There were so many unknowns, so many complications. But the bond he had begun to form with the baby felt unshakable. He couldn't simply walk away. "I know it's complicated," Keanu said quietly. "But I can't stop thinking about her. I can't stop wondering what's going to happen to her. She deserves a chance." Detective Collins watched him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "I can't make that decision for you, and I'm not suggesting you should adopt her right now. But if you're serious about this, I'll help you get in touch with the right people. There are steps you need to take if you're going to pursue this further, and I'll be here to support you through it." Keanu's heart felt like it was pounding in his chest. He had never thought he'd find himself in a situation like this, standing in front of a detective, considering adopting a child he'd only met a few days ago. But here he was, and something inside him told him it was the right thing to do. "I'm serious about this," he said, his voice firm. "I'll do whatever it takes." Over the next week, Keanu met with adoption agencies, social workers, and legal advisors. He wanted to be certain that he was prepared for the challenge ahead. He knew the process would be difficult, but he wasn't afraid. He had faced challenges in his life before, both on and off the screen, and he was determined to face this one with the same tenacity. The more he learned, the more he realized how little he knew about the complexities of adoption. There were background checks, home evaluations, and paperwork that seemed endless, but Keanu wasn't one to shy away from hard work. If this was what it took to give the baby the life she deserved, he was ready. Meanwhile, the baby continued to grow stronger. Keanu visited her every day, and as the days passed, he felt an increasing sense of attachment. The staff had grown used to him, and he became a regular presence in the nursery, even taking on the role of reading her stories and singing softly to her. One afternoon, as Keanu sat in the rocking chair, holding her in his arms, he couldn't help but marvel at the tiny life that had become such a huge part of his own. He had no idea what her future held, but he knew that he wanted to be the one to give her a chance. As he gently rocked her back and forth, he whispered, "You're not alone anymore, little one. I promise. I'm here, and I won't let you go." It was a simple promise, but in that moment, it felt like the most important thing he could say. His path was clear now. There were no guarantees, no easy answers. But Keanu knew one thing for sure. He was ready to face whatever came next for her. Keanu's life had always been one of routines, of scripts and rehearsals, of moments of fame and recognition. But now, there was a new rhythm in his life. One that revolved around the baby. A rhythm that was slower, quieter, and yet more fulfilling than anything he had experienced before. Every morning he would rise early, go for a run, and then head to the hospital to spend time with her. There was no script for this, no camera to capture the quiet moments between them, but that was part of the beauty. It was raw, real, and full of unpredictability. Days had turned into weeks, and with each passing one, Keanu felt more certain that he was making the right decision. Despite the uncertainty that lay ahead, the bond between him and the baby continued to deepen. He found joy in the simple things, feeding her, soothing her when she cried, and watching her start to smile at him. It was as though each moment with her was a gift, a new chapter that he hadn't expected, but now couldn't imagine his life without. But there was something else growing inside him too, a sense of responsibility, a realization that he wasn't just her temporary guardian anymore. He was her protector. Her future was no longer something distant or abstract. It was his to shape, in whatever way he could. Keanu had been prepared for the legal challenges that adoption would present, but he hadn't been fully prepared for how emotionally taxing it would be. The paperwork alone seemed never-ending. And every visit from social workers and adoption agency representatives brought up new questions, new obstacles, new doubts. Keanu had no intention of giving up, but the reality of what he was doing, the weight of it, often pressed down on him in a way he hadn't anticipated. It was one evening, while sitting in a cafe just outside the hospital, that he met someone who would change the trajectory of his journey. He had been reading through adoption documents when a woman approached his table. She was tall, with dark hair and glasses, dressed casually, but there was an air of kindness about her that immediately drew his attention. "Excuse me," she said, her voice hesitant. "Are you Keanu Reeves?" Keanu looked up, surprised but not bothered. "Yeah, that's me. How can I help you?" The woman smiled a little nervously. I'm sorry to intrude, but I'm Sarah Green. I'm an adoption lawyer, and I've heard about your case. I'm not sure if you're working with someone already, but I wanted to offer my help. I specialize in complicated adoption situations, and this one, well, it's very special, isn't it? Keanu blinked, taken aback. He hadn't expected someone to approach him like this, especially a lawyer, but there was something in her voice that made him listen. I don't know, he said quietly. I'm just trying to do the right thing. But it's been overwhelming. I thought I knew what to expect, but there's so much more to this than I realized. Sarah nodded sympathetically. Adoption is never easy, especially when the child involved has such a unique story. It's not just about paperwork. It's about making sure the child's future is protected, that they end up in the right hands. And from what I've heard, you're already doing an incredible job of being there for her. But the legal stuff, the system, it can be complicated, even for someone like you. Keanu sighed. I'm not sure where to go from here. I'm trying to make sure I'm doing everything right. I understand, Sarah said, her tone reassuring. That's why I'd like to offer my services. I've been following the case, and I believe I can help navigate the process. You deserve to have someone by your side who understands the system and who can guide you through it with the child's best interests at heart. Keanu was quiet for a moment, processing her words. He hadn't expected a lawyer to offer to help so openly, but there was something about Sarah's demeanor that felt right. He was a man who had always trusted his instincts, and right now, his gut was telling him that this was an opportunity he shouldn't pass up. I appreciate that, he said, finally looking up from the paperwork in front of him. I've been doing my best, but I know this isn't something I can do alone. Sarah smiled. Exactly. No one should have to. Let me help you. And so, with Sarah's assistance, things began to move more quickly. The complicated legal hurdles that had seemed insurmountable started to fall into place. The social workers, who had been slow and distant at first, started taking Keanu's case more seriously. Sarah's expertise and connections made the process smoother, and Keanu began to feel a sense of momentum he hadn't experienced in weeks. But beyond the paperwork, Sarah brought something else to the table: perspective. She had worked with numerous adoptive parents, some of them famous, some ordinary, but all of them with stories that struck her heart. She understood the complexities of what Keanu was going through, the pressure of public attention, the fears of inadequacy, and the overwhelming love that came with being a parent, whether by birth or by choice. Keanu found himself relying on her more than he had expected. The two of them spent hours discussing legal strategies, but also about parenting and what it would mean for him to take this child into his life. There were moments when the conversation turned to more personal topics, and Keanu couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for Sarah's calm presence. She wasn't just helping him with legalities, she was guiding him through the emotional maze as well. It was clear to him now that adopting the baby was not just about taking responsibility. It was about creating a life for her, a life filled with love, security, and possibility. And that meant making sure she had not just a home but a family. As the days passed, Keanu felt a growing sense of certainty. There would be more hurdles to overcome, more questions to answer, but he was no longer uncertain about what he wanted. This little girl, whose name he had learned was Emma, was his now. Whether or not the legal system saw it that way, he did. He would do whatever it took to give her the life she deserved, and with Sarah by his side, he knew he had a fighting chance to make that happen. As he walked into the hospital room later that afternoon, his heart swelled when he saw her again, her small, peaceful face still the light of his life. "You're not alone anymore, Emma," he whispered, gently stroking her hair. "You've got me, and I'll always be here." The days that followed seemed like a blur to Keanu. With Sarah's help, the adoption process began to unfold more smoothly, but the emotional weight of everything was becoming harder to bear. He had always prided himself on being a private person, someone who could keep his emotions in check. But with Emma, everything had changed. She had woven herself into the fabric of his life, and now he couldn't imagine a future without her in it. It was early one morning when Keanu received a call that shifted everything. He was sitting in his kitchen, sipping his coffee, trying to prepare himself for another day of meetings and paperwork, when his phone rang. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but something inside him told him to answer. "Hello, Mr. Reeves?" It was a woman's voice, sharp but calm. "This is Carol Thompson. I'm with the Department of Children and Family Services." Keanu felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The last thing he wanted was another complication. "Yes. How can I help you?" "We've received a new lead on the situation surrounding Emma's abandonment," Carol continued, "and we need to speak with you about it. There's something you need to know." Keanu's heart raced. "What do you mean? Is she okay?" "She's fine," Carol assured him. "But we need to speak with you about the next steps. It's about the case." Keanu's grip on his phone tightened. "What's going on?" "We've traced a potential relative of the child. We believe we've found someone who may have a legal claim to her." The words hit him like a tidal wave. For the past few weeks, Keanu had allowed himself to hope. Hope that Emma would be his. Hope that he could give her a stable life. Hope that the trauma of her abandonment would fade into the past. But now, suddenly, everything felt uncertain again. "Is this person going to try to take her from me?" Keanu asked, his voice unsteady. "We don't know yet," Carol replied. "But we need to investigate. We'll be in touch soon to discuss what comes next." The line went silent for a moment as Keanu processed her words. It was as though his world had just shifted. One minute, he had been planning a future with Emma, and the next, the foundation he had built felt as if it were crumbling beneath him. After the call, Keanu found himself staring out the window, lost in thought. He didn't know who this relative was, or how they were connected to Emma, but the thought of anyone coming into her life now, when he had already started to imagine her as his own, was a terrifying prospect. But as much as the fear gnawed at him, there was a part of Keanu that knew this was part of the process. There was no escaping the truth. Emma was still a child in the eyes of the law, and there were steps to follow. The truth, painful as it was that he had to respect the process. He couldn't just claim her as his own without facing whatever challenges lay ahead. The following days were filled with tension and uncertainty. Keanu threw himself into his visits with Emma, spending hours at the hospital, trying to keep her safe from the anxiety that was growing inside him. He talked to her constantly, even though she couldn't understand a word. He read to her, sang to her, and whispered to her that everything would be okay. But no matter how much he reassured her, he couldn't shake the knot of worry that sat heavy in his chest. Sarah, who had become more than just his legal advisor, was a constant source of support. She was always there to listen when Keanu needed to vent or when his emotions threatened to overwhelm him. But even she couldn't provide the certainty he was craving. The call from Carol had hung over them both, and each day brought a new wave of anxiety. Keanu had been to the hospital every day since the call, holding Emma and letting her little hands wrap around his finger. In the quiet moments, he would remind himself that he was doing everything he could to give her a life she deserved. But the knowledge that someone out there might be able to take her away filled him with a helplessness that he hadn't felt before. It was late one evening, after he had put in another long day of work and hospital visits, that he received another call. This time it was from Sarah. "Keanu, I've got some news," she said, her voice cautious but clear. "I've spoken with Carol. They've identified the person who claims to be a relative." Keanu's heart skipped. "And who is it?" "It's her biological aunt," Sarah explained. "Apparently Emma's mother had a sister who lives in a nearby town. She's come forward now, and she's requesting custody of Emma." Keanu felt a cold wave of shock wash over him. What does this mean? Is she going to take her? "Not immediately," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "We'll need to go through the legal process. The aunt will need to prove that she can provide a suitable home for Emma, and she'll need to go through the same assessments that you did. It's a long road ahead, but it's not a done deal." Keanu was quiet for a long moment, his mind racing. He had never imagined this scenario. An aunt, someone Emma's mother had known, someone who shared her blood, had come forward, and now Keanu's future with Emma was uncertain once again. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted, his voice strained. I can't imagine anyone else being her parent. She's mine." "I understand," Sarah said softly. "But remember, this isn't about who's the better person. This is about Emma's future, and the system has its own rules to follow. We just have to trust the process and do everything we can to protect her." Keanu nodded, but inside, he felt the storm of emotions churning. What if this aunt was the right choice? What if Emma's future with him was just a fleeting chapter in her story and she belonged with family? What if Keanu wasn't enough? But despite all the doubts and fears, one thing remained clear. Emma was his daughter now, no matter what anyone said. And he wasn't going to give up on her without a fight. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with legal battles and emotional hurdles. But Keanu was determined. He had already started to love this little girl as his own, and he wasn't about to lose her. As he walked into the hospital room that evening, he bent over Emma's crib and whispered, "We're going to fight for you, little one. I won't let anyone take you from me." And in that moment, Keanu knew that no matter how difficult the journey was, he would do whatever it took to make sure Emma had the future she deserved. The days blurred together. Each one seemed to come with more questions, more challenges. Keanu could no longer sleep through the night without waking up to a mind racing with thoughts of Emma's future. He had always been a man who took things in stride, who faced the ups and downs of life with a calm demeanor, a man who didn't flinch in the face of adversity. But this was different. Emma wasn't just another part of his life, she was his heart now. The legal battle was intense. Sarah had become his lifeline, walking him through each step of the process. They had meetings with social workers, judges, and legal experts, all trying to figure out what was best for Emma. The aunt, Carol Thompson's client, had already begun to make her case, stating her right to custody as Emma's closest living relative. It wasn't just about the legalities, it was about the deep emotional pull of family. And though Keanu understood the importance of blood ties, he couldn't shake the feeling that Emma belonged with him. Each day, as the case dragged on, Keanu found himself growing more anxious, more uncertain. Was he really the right person for her? Was he qualified to be her father? What if the aunt could offer her something he couldn't? These questions gnawed at him constantly. Still, he couldn't let go of the hope he had held on to since that first moment he found Emma in the trash. She was his now. She had to be. The courtroom was stark and quiet. Keanu had never been a fan of legal proceedings. Too much formality, too much rigidity. He was a man of action, not paper trails. But today, it was different. Today, he was fighting for Emma, and he would not be deterred. Sarah sat beside him, her calm and collected demeanor a stark contrast to the storm raging inside him. They had prepared for this moment for weeks. They had gathered evidence of Keanu's stability, his home life and his ability to provide a safe, loving environment for Emma. They had even arranged for a child psychologist to testify about the bond between them, about the security Emma felt in Keanu's care. But the aunt, her name was Laura, had her own case to present. Keanu tried to focus as the judge entered the room. The proceedings began, and both parties were given time to present their arguments. Keanu's stomach tightened as Laura stood, her hands clasped in front of her. She wasn't a bad person. He could see the concern in her eyes. But Keanu couldn't help the feeling that this was more about her own loss than what was best for Emma. Laura spoke calmly, but her words were sharp. "Your Honor, I am Emma's biological aunt. I'm the closest living relative, and I am capable of providing her with a stable home. My sister, Emma's mother, had a tragic past, but I was there for her in every way I could be. I've been searching for Emma ever since she was abandoned. I believe I am the one who should raise her." Keanu listened to Laura's words with a heavy heart. He could see her pain, her desire to do right by Emma, but something deep inside him rebelled against the idea of handing her over to anyone else. He could give Emma a future filled with love, security, and the chance to be more than just a tragedy. He had already shown her what it meant to be loved unconditionally. It was his turn next. He rose to his feet slowly, the weight of his decision pressing on his shoulders. He had never been good at speeches or public declarations, but this was different. This was about Emma's life, her future, and he would fight with every fiber of his being. "Your Honor," Keanu began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm here because I believe in what's best for Emma. She's been through more than anyone should ever have to endure, and she deserves a future filled with love, safety, and stability. When I found her, she was abandoned, alone. But since that moment, she has become my world. I have taken care of her, I have loved her, and I will continue to do so for the rest of my life. I may not be her biological father, but I am her father. I'm the one who's been there for her through every sleepless night, every moment of fear. I'm the one she trusts, the one she looks to for comfort and security." Keanu paused for a moment, looking around the room. Every eye was on him, but his focus was entirely on the judge. "I don't know what the future holds," he continued, his voice growing stronger, "but I do know this: I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make sure Emma has the best possible future. If I have to fight for her, I will. If I have to prove that I can give her a home, I will. I'm not asking for a favor. I'm asking for a chance to be the father she deserves." There was a silence in the room after Keanu finished speaking. It was as though time itself had paused, allowing everyone present to feel the depth of his words. He could see the judge's eyes softening, her gaze lingering on him. It wasn't just a speech, it was the truth. The days that followed were agonizing. Keanu had poured his heart into the courtroom, but there was no guarantee of what would happen next. All he could do was wait. The uncertainty gnawed at him. He kept thinking of Emma's small face, the way her eyes lit up when she saw him. He thought of the bond they had formed, the trust she had in him. She was his daughter, in every sense. That mattered. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the decision came. Keanu sat in Sarah's office, his fingers tapping nervously on the armrest of the chair. Sarah had a phone to her ear, listening intently. Keanu could hardly breathe. He had been through so much, so many ups and downs, that he wasn't sure how much more he could take. Finally, Sarah hung up the phone and turned to him with a smile. "We did it," she said softly. "The judge ruled in your favor. Emma is officially yours." Keanu felt the world shift beneath him. For a moment he was frozen, unable to comprehend the words. But then, as the reality set in, tears welled up in his eyes. He had won. Emma was his. "Thank you," he whispered, unable to say more. Keanu didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of peace. The battle wasn't over. It would never be over. But Emma was safe. She was with him, and for the first time he could breathe easy. As he walked to the hospital to tell her the news, he knew that no matter what challenges they might face in the future, they would face them together. The bond between them was unbreakable, and in the quiet of the night, when he held Emma in his arms, he whispered, "We did it, little one. You're home now. You're finally home." The sun had barely risen that morning, casting a soft golden light across the city as Keanu walked out of his apartment building, Emma cradled carefully in his arms. It had been weeks since the court ruling, but the new life that lay ahead felt like an entirely new chapter. Keanu had always been a private person, but now he found himself opening up to a future he had never fully envisioned before, one filled with responsibility, love, and the kind of joy he hadn't known was possible. As he stepped outside into the crisp morning air, he could feel the weight of the past months lifting from his shoulders. The legal battles were behind him, and Emma was officially his daughter. There were no more doubts, no more fears about what the future might hold. He had fought for her, and he had won. Emma stirred in his arms, a small whimper escaping her lips. Keanu looked down at her and smiled, running a gentle hand over her soft hair. She was his daughter. His heart swelled with an overwhelming sense of love. She was the light in his life now, and he would do everything in his power to protect that light. "Let's go home, kiddo," he whispered, adjusting her in his arms and heading towards the car parked at the curb. The city around him seemed to buzz with life, but in that moment it felt like everything had quieted. All that mattered was the tiny life he held close to his chest. The days after the court ruling were a blur of joy and adjustment. Keanu spent his time at home with Emma, learning the ins and outs of fatherhood. The quiet moments they shared together felt like miracles, whether it was feeding her, rocking her to sleep, or simply watching her gaze at the world with wide-eyed wonder. She was growing, changing, and Keanu couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride as he watched her thrive. His life, once so solitary and filled with the demands of a career, had become a whirlwind of responsibility, but also of fulfillment. There were challenges, of course, there always would be, but the challenges felt different now. They were his challenges to face, and they were worth it for Emma. There were moments in the quiet hours of the evening when Keanu would reflect on everything that had led him here. He still remembered that fateful day when he found Emma in the trash, the uncertainty and fear that had gripped him as he held her for the first time. But now, as he sat in his living room with Emma in his arms, the uncertainty had faded, replaced by a fierce determination to be the best father he could be. One evening, as Keanu sat in the nursery rocking Emma to sleep, Sarah called. It was a rare moment of quiet in his chaotic new life, and he answered the phone with a smile, knowing she had been one of his biggest supporters throughout this journey. "Hey, Sarah," he said, settling into the rocking chair. "Hey, Keanu," she replied, her voice warm. "I just wanted to check in. How are things going with Emma?" Keanu smiled as he looked down at his daughter, her tiny hand wrapped around his finger. "Better than I could have imagined. She's perfect. It's not easy, but it's worth every second. I wouldn't change a thing." "I'm so glad to hear that," Sarah said softly. "I know it's been a roller coaster, but you've done something amazing here. You've created a life for her that she deserves." Keanu paused for a moment, the weight of her words settling on him. "I just want to give her the life she deserves, Sarah. I want her to grow up knowing she's loved and cared for." "And she will," Sarah replied. "You're doing an incredible job. Just remember, you're not alone. You have a whole team of people behind you." Keanu chuckled softly, looking down at Emma. "I know. I've learned that. I didn't know what I was missing before, but now I understand." The call ended soon after, but the conversation lingered in Keanu's mind. He wasn't alone in this. He had Sarah. He had a community of friends. And now, most importantly, he had Emma. Together they were a family. Weeks turned into months, and life with Emma continued to evolve. The early days of sleepless nights and adjusting to the responsibilities of parenthood slowly gave way to a routine. Keanu's world was no longer filled with the frantic pace of celebrity life. His days revolved around Emma. The red carpets, the premieres, and the flashing cameras seemed like a distant memory now. He had found something far more important. One afternoon, as he sat in the park with Emma, watching her play with a small toy in the grass, Keanu felt a deep sense of peace. The world was moving around him. People were walking by. But for the first time in a long time, he felt grounded. Emma was happy, healthy, and thriving. He had given her a chance to grow, to heal, and to experience the world in a way she never could have before. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the park, Keanu sat back on the bench and let out a deep sigh of contentment. His life had changed in ways he could never have predicted, and though the road ahead would still be full of challenges, he was ready. He was prepared to be the father Emma needed, the man she deserved. He watched her closely as she giggled and chased after a butterfly. Every day with her was a reminder of just how much he had to be grateful for. She was a gift, his gift. And as the golden light bathed the park in a warm glow, Keanu knew one thing for certain: this was only the beginning. They had a future to build together, and he would do whatever it took to make sure Emma's was filled with love, laughter, and happiness. This was his new beginning, and he couldn't wait to see where it would take them.